Alright then, so I guess it'll be story time right now, so let's jump into book 2. Load her up here. And let's just get to it. Alright, so doesn't it look so much nicer having all these books in here you can actually buy from the Ziggurar library? Really helps to flesh it out more. Alright, so before I basically continue to actually start reading these, let's just give a little bit of background about why books 1 and 4 are basically over in the Elvia's library, and books 2 and 3 here over in Ziggurat's library. So basically, when I was writing this basically up these books and the chapters for them, there's basically multiple chapters basically for basically for the lore basically to be presented, and because there's just so many, and because these specific pieces of lore books 2 and 3 are very anti-Ziggurar, I sort of suggested to Dark God that instead of it being all in one place, that the books that are basically sort of anti-Ziggurar should be sort of maybe kept at Ziggurar, because they don't exactly want other people to be reading those books and being disparaged against the Zigguramth. So basically the idea is these books are here because the Ziggurar obviously stole them from the Elvia Capital, Cornac Capital, and here they are. Alright, so let's just get into it. We'll buy the first one here, book 2, chapter 1, At the Gates. While in the service, the Nargol appeared to be in total control of the situation. Underneath it all, this was very much not the case. In order to attempt to mitigate trouble, they actively attempted to confiscate any and all magical items they could find from refugees entering the city, and hide their leaders from being assassinated for their parts in the Spellblaze. Spellcasters in their army were sent underground, mindful of the danger they were in, but also not wishing to incite angry citizens further. Alright, now, before I sort of continue with this part of the story itself, note that basically compared to book 1, which is basically sort of the travel to Elvia and sort of describing the events of what basically sort of happened after the Spellblaze, this very much builds into the lore of I think it's the Age of Dusk, where it's basically essentially sort of describing the events that sort of happening the other kingdoms that are basically being affected by the Spellblaze. So basically we have this halfling city of the Nargol Capital, and we're basically getting a sort of glimpses as to what events basically transpiring of them now, as opposed to the Shaloran. Alright, so let's just jump into it and we'll basically talk about what's going on here. So I descended slowly and carefully down the blasted hillside and crossed over the river where some stones emerged I could step on. Making my way over the burnt grass, I joined with the procession of refugees making their way toward the city gates. I had to wait a long while as the guards slowly inspected wagons and asked questions of those passing through. While it seemed no one was being turned away, drawn closer I saw one dwarf beginning to holler as a guard confiscated an item from him. The dwarf was still hollering when he was allowed entry, a torrent of profanity coming from the dwarf for every step he took inside. After a dozen more or so in front of me were possessed by the guards, I was finally next. I immediately held out the papers I received from the general. The guard nearest to me gave notice to the insignia on him and motioned to another of the guards to come over. After glancing at the papers together, they talked to each other in a hushed tone, and then one of them proceeded to run off with the paper at a brisk pace to a nearby tower. Before long, the guard returned, followed by another halfling. Judging from the immaculate armor he wore, I quickly realized he must be their superior. He walked towards me with a slow, methodical pace, his gaze seemingly analyzing me fully. Standing in front of me, his eyes looked up into mine as I looked down on him. Then he abruptly turned away and gestured to one of the guards. The guard immediately approached and held out his hands. Sensing that I should give the chest now, I pulled it out of my pack and handed it to him. Giving a quick nod as he received the chest, the guard quickly hurried away with it. He dashed through the gate and around the walls out of sight. Another guard soon approached and in a polite tone stated, "Welcome to the Nargol Kingdom." With this I was ushered through the gate as the guards began to resume their searches and queries to the refugees behind me. Looking around, I saw a great many tents and hastily constructed shanties, likely put up to house the many refugees fleeing into the city. The refugees themselves sat around as if devoid of any purpose. Some lifelessly stared toward the west, likely to summons they had been forced to come from. Others seemed to stare blankly towards the sky, as if perhaps waiting for more death to fall from it as it had during the Spellblaze. Saddened by the sight of all this, and a sense of loss that hung in the air, I decided to move on. I navigated myself towards the buildings of the settlement. Ruins of destroyed buildings lay across the street, with some featuring collapsed roofs and walls. I could see through the gaps in the stones of one of the damaged buildings a family of halflings. Further down the street, a wooden sign for a tavern lay on the ground. Feeling somewhat peckish at this point, I made my way toward the building next to the sign, hoping that they may have some food to purchase. Inside, a motley collection of halflings, humans, and dwarves sat at various tables. A bit more lively than the refugees outside, some conversed with each other while the others grumbled. As I entered the tavern, one human immediately took notice and approached, saying, "Hey, aren't you that thalore from before?" "Yeah, it is you." Wondering who this human was, I wondered if he was perhaps insane. Seemingly sensing this, he quickly stated, "Ah, perhaps you don't recognize me. I'm the messenger that happened to be in that inn up north. You probably remember me arguing with the elder halfwit from before." I clenched my teeth a bit. I wondered if I might be in trouble. Again, however, the human made another quick statement. "Don't worry, I don't think you'll find anyone disagreeing with what you did to him, and I was thinking of doing the same anyway." He would have eventually been lynched for saying things as he did. Someone would have silenced him sooner or later. Curious as to what the messenger just said, I cautiously replied, "What do you mean?" To this the messenger raised an eyebrow before saying, "What? You think that any of the guards would have stopped someone like that halfling from being killed? Such incidents have become commonplace nowadays." Soon smiling at me, the messenger began to gesture toward a nearby seat. I wasn't much interested in chatting with him, but thinking perhaps he may be able to inform me a bit of the events, I decided to accept his offer. I moved to sit down, ordering some food to eat. The messenger began making small talk, knowing the devastation brought from the Spellblaze, viciously attacking the mages within each of his sentences, and lamenting the loss of some of his friends. For a time, I let him talk as I ate my food. Oddly enough, the messenger didn't give me his name, or ask for my own, perhaps being at least somewhat knowledgeable of Thalorean customs in that regard. I didn't actually notice this when I talked to him initially, only realizing it due to later events that would unfold. Alright, so, just so you can probably, guess, this chapter here and how I basically wrote it. I'll note that, basically, compared to, the first book, I'll note that the second chapter, very much builds upon, a lot of, what's basically, sort of, inspiring, the first chapter now. Because I basically have, that first chapter as a foundation to, build, off of. So, basically, the events, of, what basically transpires to, cross down toward, Elvia, are basically starting to, take shape here. So, you basically get the glimpse that, the story is, not entirely, going to be, disconnected from, other bits and parts of it. It's, very much every, sort of action that Fate basically takes, it will have an effect, basically, later down the road. So, you know, it's very much like, you know, something about the story, basically. I wrote the story, it's like, you know, whenever you basically read it, you felt like, you know, there's some effectiveness, basically, going forward, so, yeah. Alright, so, let's get to the second chapter now. So, Blazing Madness. In the market, I purchased several items to help me for when I forged my way back towards Forlorn Lands. I bought about 3 weeks' worth of rations for myself, as I planned to perhaps explore a little bit before finally arriving home. I also procured a fine steel utility knife and a steel hatchet. I wasn't sure I would really need this much for my journey. I could likely have explored the entirety of Maj'Eyal with it, but I never imagined what role everything I bought in the market would soon come to play in the future. So, I'll note that in the task bit here about it, this is sort of like, you know, foreshadowing to, like, you know, stuff that'll basically come forward, so, I'll note basically I sort of like threw this in here because, like, you know, going forward from like this point, I want to basically have like this sort of like the build upon like this little piece of like, you know, Ita's text right here. So again, it's building upon like, you know, what's to come, so to speak. Alright, let's just get to actual reading because that's what you're basically here for, probably. At least that's what I'm here for. Out of my window, I saw many residents of the city run to help deal with the I bought the wrong book here, by the way. That's a mistake. Alright, well, we skipped ahead here a little bit, so I guess I'll have to, like, you know, read this basically from the lore feed, so... Let's see here. Show no lore. I find this isn't Forbidden Cults, but, you know, that's basically when, like, this was basically brought out, like, in Forbidden Cults, so, yeah, whatever. Alright, so, let's actually buy the right book here, exchange of information. Alright, so, you know, it is really hard to know someone. The messenger was a good example of this, as I would soon find out. I had pegged him for being a disgruntled human that had suffered greatly because of Spellblaze. In reality, he was much more than just disgruntled, and I believe he may have been a member of the group instigating the spell hunt. I'm sure he and the others who had left after with that human in a dark cloak died taking part in a nefarious plot that I will learn the day after. But did he die willingly? That's the real question, I think, about now in regards to him. Alright, so let's actually talk about this guy here. So, finishing my meal, I decided to probe the messenger for information. Upon the completion of his last tirade, I asked, "So how are things faring here?" A sigh escaped the man as he answered, "Well, the Nargols appear to have everything under control. They are managing to get enough food for all the refugees streaming in, even managed to procure some alcohol for those dwarves. I have to say, it was quite a surprise to see them out here. I wonder if they happen to have any more homes elsewhere in the continent outside of the Iron Throne. Hard to really know with how secret the dwarves are, though." While I wasn't exactly interested in the dwarves, that last statement disconnected quite a bit from what I knew about them. From my knowledge of the dwarves, they all lived in the Iron Throne, or at least cities nearby to it. Querying the messenger, he soon explained. Well, the dwarves you see here now had a home over there in the Western Mountains. The Cornacs were completely ignorant that they had taken up residence so close to them, and the dwarves likely would have kept it a secret. Unfortunately for them, they were forced to show themselves since the blasted mages caused their home to collapse in on them. Satisfied with the answer, I remembered about the Howling Dwarf when entering the city. I wondered if perhaps the messenger might have might know something about what was I was all about. Knowing it, I said, "You wouldn't happen to know anything regarding items the dwarves might be carrying that the guards of the city gate would confiscate, would you?" The messenger's shoulders. That's actually shoulders, but you know, I guess I misspelled it, but whatever. The messenger's shoulders shrugged before he replied back. Likely was carrying some item of arcane properties that an accursed mage enchanted long ago. Those dwarves seem to be getting the worst treatment in regards to that, with what little care they give towards whether an item can have it with magic or not. Shaking his hand before going on, the messenger mused aloud. You know, the Nargol are actively attempting to confiscate items of magical origin as a means of appeasement to placate the halflings living here. They say that it's too dangerous for civilians to carry such items. Personally, I say it's too dangerous for anyone to be carrying such items, them included. Of course, they are too arrogant to bother fellow halflings living in the city already in regards to giving up such items, expecting them to voluntarily give them up. Really, it is just the dwarves. The halfling refugees from outside the city and us humans getting our positions taken away. The human proceeded to laugh as he finished saying those words. The messenger stopped laughing, though, as a human in a dark cloak approached, and leaned down to say something to him. The messenger nodded to the figure, upon which he said back, "I'll catch up later. Relay back to me the plan when we are ready." To this, the human in a dark cloak bowed, hurried over to another table of a couple halflings, and then a table of a dwarf, before then leaving the establishment and disappearing. The halflings and dwarfs finished their food, and packed up their things before they quietly left as well. Wondering just who this messenger was, I glanced at him to see his examining eyes looking towards me. In a relaxed voice, the messenger said, "Don't mind them. We're having such a nice little conversation to have the others ruin it." At that point, I realized that there was more to this human than I initially thought. I wondered if he might be a bit more dangerous than I was giving him credit for. Perhaps a bit rashly, I decided to see just how much this man knew, so I quietly stated, "You wouldn't happen to have any plans to deal with the Shaloran?" Almost instantly, the man's stance and posture changed before, in a new tone, he continued to speak. "Oh, wouldn't it be so great to wipe those miserable louts from the face of Yael? I assume you likely left your forest because you know they were responsible, and would like nothing more than bathe in their blood. Don't most of us all? In due time, they will be made to pay in full for unleashing the Spellblaze of Maj'Eyal." Cautiously, I asked in as angry a voice as I could muster, "Spellblaze, is that what they call it?" Quickly confirming back to me this, he stated, "Indeed, or so I've been told." Seeing as how the man liked to talk, I waited for him to feed me more information. "I'll tell you what, perhaps you should come with me to a little gathering of friends to discuss it. We've got a plan that we will be putting in motion soon to ensure nature never suffers as badly as I'm sure a flora can feel it suffer. You see, while the Shaloran are most definitely responsible, it isn't like none of the other races knew about their so-called grand plan. Every race, save perhaps the dwarves, had some knowledge of the Spellblaze. Obviously, the messenger was likely part of whatever group the Shaloran general had feared. I could tell that the messenger most definitely was in whatever schemes were being orchestrated too, and possibly ones that required secrecy, as confirmed from the cloaked man from before. I considered going to his little gathering of friends, but I wasn't really interested in participating in whatever scheme they were going to partake in, and I could sense a feeling of danger as well. "I thank you for the offer, but I must decline," I finally said. To this I got a raised eyebrow as he quickly stayed back. "Really? I would think a thalore such as yourself would jump at a chance to exact retribution against any who defile nature as has been done." His words made me think for a moment, but I simply got up and left. I remember him calling out that I should I changed my mind, that I would be welcomed as a new initiate for sure. The sun had begun to set in the sky as I left the building. Figuring I should look for a place to stay the night, I found an inn and purchased his room. I figured that in the morning I would go to the market and buy some food and supplies for my journey home. I slept soundly until early in the morning, before the sun had begun to rise, when the sounds of screaming filled my ear. Wondering what was going on, I looked out my windows of my room to see fire and smoke rising from a large building in the distance. Alright, so, much like, as I've already stated, basically, we're starting to, sort of, get into, sort of, the workings of, the Ziggurat here. And, you're basically sort of, getting an idea of, sort of, how they're basically sort of, operating, I guess, a little bit here. Even though it seems like a little bit, shall we say, a little bit, given to us, so to speak, because this guy talks so much, but whatever. I think it works fine for, building up on a lore here to, sort of, give an idea, basically, of, how, the Ziggurat basically operated, so whatever. Alright, so I sort of, messed up there, so I'll have to basically go in here to, get, the, the Blazing Madness, but whatever. Oh, good, so it pops up like this, that's good now. Alright, so, let's read on! So, I'll basically skip the italics text, we already saw that, but whatever. Let's go down to, the next little bit here. So, out of my window, I saw many residents of the city run to help deal with the fire. They quickly got to work in cordoning off the area and preventing it from further spreading. But despite their efforts, many homes were enveloped in flames before the fire was fully contained. Before long, many souls arrived and pushed back everyone, including those residents helping to put out the fire. For a small while, the fire was left to burn, though it soon began to diminish. I don't know how they did it, but soon after the fires began to die down, maybe perhaps the mages had come out of hiding and used war magic in a secret to drown it out. It is hard to think of any other explanation. As the fires began to simmer, some of the soldiers moved to inspect the burnt-out homes for anyone who may not have escaped from the fire's destruction. Alright, so yeah, spelling mistakes are a thing, by the way, in my writing, but you know, it was a lot of words basically, so you know, I'm gonna have a couple in here, but whatever. After that, they moved on to investigate the buildings where the fire first started. I noticed after some of the soldiers had entered the building that they were pulling out several bundles wrapped in blankets. I would come to learn that those bundles were remains of those suspected of starting a fire. Whether by accident or on purpose, they had been killed by their own act of arson. I would also learn that those killed consist of human, 2 halflings, and a dwarf. I'm certainly glad I left the messenger when I did. During this time, I remained in my room. When I finally left, I talked with the innkeeper about the event, learning that the building was one to house many of the possessions that had been confiscated from the refugees. When I left the inn, I could hear the conversations from many residents on the streets as they talked about the destruction of nearly every arcane item stored within a storehouse. They also murmured that some of the residents from the nearby homes were suspected to have been killed by the fire, as well as a couple of residents who had come to help put out the fire initially. The fire would be talked about continually as I made my way to Nargol Market. Even there, many of the merchants and patrons continued their talk of the event. Finishing up my purchases, it was at this point I remembered another patron noting something about how the refugees were quite upset. I turned to approach the patron saying, exactly why would the refugees be upset? The patron, a halfling who wore fairly fine clothes but appeared to be of common work, turned with a stunned look in my direction. Sighing, I soon stated, yes, I'm a thalore. What's up with the refugees? Indeed you are, the halfling quickly stated. Well, I don't know why they are upset. You'd think they would be content with getting food and drink, as well as being allowed to put up those miserable tents in the city. Something about the fire has seemingly stirred them up. The halfling stopped talking to look up at something with a concerned expression, before turning around and abruptly running. As the halfling fled, I soon heard a yelling behind me. Turning around, I saw a mob of ragged refugees rush through the stalls as the merchants began to flee. Wood was smashed and cloth torn as the refugees moved by them. I moved in the opposite direction away from them, but the patrons and merchants who couldn't get away were knocked down and trampled. A few who attempted to stand up to the mob or protect their stalls soon found themselves beaten and bruised on the ground. This continued for several minutes before the first guards appeared to have restored order. It took the guards several minutes to assemble themselves, within which the refugees continued to wreck a good deal of the market. When the guards finally moved in to clear them out, many of the refugees scattered, leaving debris and injured merchants and patrons everywhere. As order was restored to the scene, some guards came to check to see if I was alright before one of the guards pulled me aside to interrogate me as to what had happened. I relayed back to the guard the events that I had seen, as I had seen them unfold. After telling my account, I was directed to leave this area. Moving away from the market, I wondered what other scenes of chaos I might see if I remained within Nargol City. While I had evaded danger, it could have been very well me getting trampled or knocked aside in that market. I made a decision then to begin making my way back toward the city gates. As I made my way toward the gates, though, I noticed a gathering mob of refugees and even some citizens in front of me. I should have headed past them, but beyond them I heard a voice ringing out above them. The time has come for action, but it must be directed at the source of those behind all the harm. I stopped and turned my head as I heard the words, something compelling me to stay and listen to what was being said. Drawn in by the voice, I began to make my way toward the outskirts of the crowd. Alright, so a little bit more information basically here. So basically, like, you know, we're seeing that, like, you know, chaos is basically sort of like erupting in like the Nargol Kingdom, and it's probably like, you know, being instigated by like the Ziggurat. Some of it basically like, you know, definitely being, others perhaps like, you know, like this, like, you know, just being a, like, you know, symptom of it, but whatever. Now, you know what, I'm actually gonna like just turn on the audio here a little bit because it's getting a little bit annoying, so let's just turn that down a little bit because, you know, why not? You know, I'm actually tempted to leave the music basically turned down because it's like, you know, not that important to basically have for this game, but whatever. I'll turn it back up probably, but whatever. Alright, so we're about halfway through here. I guess I should probably take a drink of water, so just give me a moment here. Alright, so despicable atrocities. Was it anger against magic that drove people to the acts of violence against the mages in the aftermath of the Spellblaze? Or was it perhaps something else? While I can't say I am an expert on the humans, halflings, or dwarves, the depravity I would witness on the street, leading out to the Nargol Kingdom, would go beyond what I would expect to have been possible for any sentient being to do. Epic foreshadowing is epic, you know, but whatever. As I peered into the voice, the voice rang out again. Aimlessly, your anger is directed against those who do not deserve it. I say directed against the source of all the tragedies that have been inflicted. I began to push my way through the crowd, wondering who was speaking, or what they were speaking about. The voice continued. Wherever magic is found, it will eventually fail and bring calamity. The fire from this morning was an example of this, as a bunch of refugees broke into the warehouse where their confiscated magical items were stored to retrieve them. In their hubris, they burned down the building with the arcane powers found within the items therein. Making my way toward the middle, I looked up to see a halfling and humans facing out to the crowd. They wore a couple of masks that hid their identities, but I recognized a dark cloak worn by the human. Judging from the fact that the human was raising his arms, I assumed he was speaking, though I can't say for sure, as the masks they wore covered their facial expressions. The voice began again. The results of the fire killed many of the residents sleeping within their houses nearby, more lives killed by magic. The only good thing that can be said of the incident was that many of those same magical items they sought to take were destroyed in the ensuing fire, no longer staining the world with their taint. Within my mind, the words of the voices pierced through my head. I could feel the anger behind the voice as it continued to speak. I saw those around me being swayed by both the words spoken and emotions behind them. Many began to say such things as magic is to blame and down with magic, as the voice continued again. Of course, you need not be told about the devastation you have already seen firsthand. Much like the actions that led to this warehouse being burned down, it was the thalore mages that unleashed this destruction that ravaged the lands and warped the skies. It is as I continue to say, wherever magic is found, it will eventually fail and bring calamity. The voice began to speak faster and with more passion as it continued on. There can be no denying that we would be better off free from the effects of the magic, lest we see these calamities continue to repeat. The Nargol regions will take no action against the halflings within the city in their searches. If we are to protect our world, we will have to take up the task ourselves. Any artifact or item with even a hint of magical nature must be identified and properly destroyed to prevent it from causing harm. We must also see to it that those who practice or who have any connection to the deplorable activities of the arcane arts dealt with as well, lest they trigger another catastrophe in their arrogance. By this point, the crowd was beginning to chant such phrases as destroy the arcane, kill the spellcasters, and end the magic arts. I myself was also beginning to feel the sentiment too, though resisted the urge to join in. Soon the voice began to issue instructions, demanding wood be brought into the street and justice be enacted. The crowd began to disperse through nearby buildings, and they began to pile up the wood up on the ground. More masked individuals began to step forward, carrying sticks of wood on their shoulders, as well as large bundles of rope. I was puzzled as stakes of wood were erected toward the sky within the piles of wood that had been raised. While the wood was being placed, the voice began to give out names of those suspected magical wrongdoings within the city. A new instruction was given to bring them here, along with any magical items that could be found. Before long, groups of crowds made their way into the houses and even into the tents of refugees, bringing back many of those I assumed to be named. Those being brought cried out as they were dragged on the ground in confusion and terror. The voice then instructed that they be tied to the stakes of wood, that had been erected and their magical ends cast at their feet. Hearing this, the crowd immediately grabbed the rope and like, you know, tied the individuals were bound by their hands and feet to the wood. So, you know what that's basically all about. As if guided by some twisted force, accusations of magical wrongdoings were made by mass individuals against those who were bound. Sometimes certain items were picked up, and by some warped practice they were made to produce sickly blows. Those deemed guilty by the crowd were kicked and beaten, unable to defend themselves as they remained bound to the stakes. Before long, a couple of those individuals wearing masks came forward with unlit torches. It was at this point I began to realize what the wood was for, as the torches were lit, and began to dance of flame. What happened next I still remember vividly in my mind, as it burned by the thrown torches that glided through the air, and the searing flames that spread across the wood. The burning victims immediately began to let loose a torrent of screams as the smoldering heat crawled up their bodies, and their skin began to blacken and burn. As this was happening, I could hear the voice who had stirred the people around me to their brutal acts let loose a wretched cry that echoes through my head. The rest of the crowd followed suit, the symphony of cries building up in a crescendo to the point that they were the only ones heard as the victims slowly ceased to live. I remember retching uncontrollably as I staggered away to the side of the building. The horribleness of the act truly sickened me to my very being, but I was perhaps more sickened by what the voice would come to say next. "You all have done well, but it will take more than this to make our world safe," the voice said. "If you wish to come join me in the fight for nature, and we can ensure the arcane forces like those that have brought us misery will never threaten the world again. Find me and be welcome as a new initiative for our cause to save Maj'Eyal." I remember that I could see many of the amassed individuals disappear into the crowds at this point, their aims achieved. I would come to learn very quickly as well just how much of an impact these words would have on the mob in front of me too. A group of the Nargol guards would eventually appear, and they began to guard themselves to disperse the crowd and restore order. The crowd offered little resistance to the encroaching force of guards that rushed forward, and many fled into the dark alleys of buildings or through the tents of refugees. As the guards took control of the area, their attention turned toward the swimming fire and the charred corpses. Cries of anguish came from the individuals who I assumed to be the loved ones and friends of those killed. At this point, I could take no more of the events that were unfolding in front of me, and I turned to leave the area and the fiery carnage that had taken place. However, as I passed by, a hand reached out of its opening, throwing me inside. Alright, so, I want to note that, like, you know, basically, like, you know, this, like, chapter here, it very much builds on, like, the fact that, like, you know, the Zingers aren't just, like, you know, some harmless organization. They are very much, like, you know, willing to, like, do, like, these, like, you know, unspeakable acts, basically, to, like, you know, complete their aims. And it very much, like, you know, basically shows off a lot of, like, you know, what they basically had prepared for it, basically do so, because obviously they were, like, doing some sort of, like, mind control over the crowd here, which is basically, like, you know, that's basically intended to be. And they were basically protecting themselves with the mask basically on their faces to, like, you know, I guess, like, you know, do something basically, but, you know, you get the idea. Basically, the masks were, like, you know, worn by the Zingers to sort of hide their identities, but also to, like, you know, protect them from, like, you know, the mind-altering effects, basically, of, like, what was basically going on. I'll also note, by the way, as well, basically, as like, Uranus, I'll note that basically, like, you know, the cacophony of screams also builds up upon, like, you know, the sort of lore basically being anti-magic, because, if you basically fight, like, anti-magic characters in this game, you notice that they basically, like, you know, have, like, the talent basically, like, you know, screams out to, like, you know, disrupt, like, the enemy mages, so that's basically what they, like, you know, that's, like, sort of, like, you know, harkening back to, so, a lot of, like, this chapter here very much builds upon, like, you know, basically, like, you know, what's basically in the game here, so we're basically, like, you know, seeing, like, firsthand, basically, like, you know, the skills, basically, like, the Zinger for, like, you know, being applied, like, you know, in, like, all their glory, so to speak. Alright, so, let's get to, like, you know, chapter 5, Sonic Trickery. So, before I actually, like, you know, continue here, I'll note that, like, a big part of, like, this, like, you know, this book, like, I basically wrote, like, you know, the Escapades of Fay Willows. There wasn't a whole lot of, like, you know, a lot of mention of, like, flora and lore, and we didn't really get see, like, a lot of lore basically revolving, like, you know, Elvia, like, itself. And we didn't really have a whole lot of lore basically about the Nargol Kingdom, or I guess about, like, you know, some of, like, the classes in this game, so basically, like, you know, what I really want to do is, like, sort of, like, build out, like, a lot of, like, you know, what was, like, not being, like, explored, like, you know, in, like, the game, like, so far, at the time, like, you're writing this, like, you know, this, like, escapade. And now we're getting like to the psionic part here, and we're actually starting to see like a little bit more of like discussion basically happening regarding some of the elements of this game that like you don't commonly see being like mentioned in the lore until now. All right, so psionic trickery, let's go. I'm told that what I had likely witnessed in the tent was a result of a psionic slaver. Using my own psyche against me, a manifested image of my own thoughts emerged for which the slaver could use against me. I had been lucky as I had managed to free myself from the slaver's hold, dispelling the image. Had I not done so, it was entirely possible that I could have been becoming thralled to the slaver's will and made to do their billings unquestionably. So I'm not bothering this part right here, by the way. For those basically remember, like basically like that quest basically in this game where like you have to fight like the psionic slavers and like that like sort of like that like Yake inspired like area. This like sort of like builds upon like that sort of idea. So we're actually seeing like that basically applied to lore here a little bit now. So that's basically what that's basically inspired by, but whatever. All right, so let's just talk about it here by like actually reading a chapter. So let's get to it. I hit the ground hard as I landed toward the back of the tent. Dazed, I began to stand to look up at who had thrown me. Coming face to face with one of the masked individuals who I assumed to help take part in the event I had just seen. Slowly a hand reached up to remove the mask, revealing the face of the human messenger. He began to laugh before finally speaking and saying, "Fancy meeting you here. I knew I saw something in you when we conversed in the inn." The messenger laughed some more while I got up. I must have been in a bit of shock from the impact, as my vision seemed fuzzy and hazy, while the things in the tent seemed seemingly blurred together. Demandingly, I responded to the messenger. "What do you want? Why have you thrown me in here?" The messenger stopped laughing, and a calm smile appeared on his face. "Because I would like to have words with you, of course. What were you doing when you came here? When you came to Nargol Kingdom?" I froze at those words, wondering how much danger I was in. The messenger stood unnaturally silent, his eyes seemingly reading me as thoughts of what to say flew through my mind. I started in fright. "I was delivering some medical aid for the Nargles to use." A hard blow then struck my face as the messenger slapped me, sending me reeling to the side of the tent. The messenger stayed in a raised voice, "Indeed," before turning his head to shout at me, saying, "From the Shaloran!" Taking a step forward, the messenger gave me a hard kick to the stomach, the force winning me and causing me to fall to the ground. I soon received another kick from the back of the heel to my face, causing blood to stream out. Bending down and picking me up by the hair, the messenger drew me close to his face, spitting in it with both his saliva and his words. "I have thought better of you since you killed that adorable halfling. I figure you might be a fellow ally of nature, but this isn't the case, is it? You made it down to those Shaloran, beyond that little wall of magic smoke they put up to hide themselves from us. You could have carried out a small portion of nature's wrath, but instead of enacting nature's fury, you turned your back on it and sided with those who unleashed the Spellblaze on us." Crying now, I was sobbing tears that mixed with the blood coming out of my face. Between sobs, I quickly stayed. Enough pain has been felt already without adding to it, before my head was abruptly smashed into the ground to the messenger. He yelled back, "No amount of pain, Fay, will make up for what they have done. Every last one of those Shaloran deserve to die as painfully as those we burned." The messenger continued to rant, but hearing my name called, I stopped to think, ignoring the rest of what he had to say. How did he know my name? I never gave it to him, to anyone in the Nargol Kingdom, or even any of the Shaloran for that matter. "How do you know my name?" I said to the messenger. His ranting cut off immediately, as the messenger looked down at me before replying. "Whatever do you mean, Fay? You told me your name back at when... Abruptly the messenger stopped talking, and seemingly the facial expressions seemed to fade away. leaving a faceless humanoid. I didn't know what was going on, but he knew then that this was an imposter. I could feel an anger within me, and with my hand I grabbed whatever it was that I've been talking to. It struggled to keep a hold of me, trying to keep me down, but being closer to the ground, I managed to pull it down with me. With my other hand, I pulled back and began to puncture at his head, until it seemingly faded from existence. I began to regain vision of my surroundings, and looking around I noticed a human with a dark cloak. I quickly realized that this was the same human who had briefly visited the messenger when I was talking to him in the inn, as well as the one who stood in the center of the crowd and likely instigated the barbaric display outside. Getting up, I said again, "Who are you, really?" The figure began to back up in the direction of the tent opening, as if to escape now that I was free of whatever he had done to me. Moving to chase the fiend before he fled out of the tent, I began to run towards the opening. I don't know what happened next, but the next moment I found myself face down on the ground. I was pinned to the ground, unable to move or speak. Attempting to look at what was above me, I noticed a halfling, like in the same one that had been staying with the human in the crowd. The human stopped moving away, and after a brief moment of surveying the situation, he came to stand next to me. As the human hovered over me, he stated, "That was quite unexpected. You must have some impressive willpower to resist me, thalore. I'm afraid, though, that if I can't bend you to my will, then I'm going to have to kill you." As the words trailed off, the human reached with one hand into his cloak, pulling out a small dagger, with which I assumed to kill me. I jostled around and attempted to break free of the halfling's hold, yet somehow, despite the halfling's smaller size than my own, I could not break free, and was doing this with just one arm. Taking a dagger in hand, the human pulled back and then thrust forward to finish me off. I was sure I would be killed, but in the next instant I noticed the dagger tumbling in the air. A bit confused at this, it would take me a moment to realize the halfling that is holding me down had prevented the human from killing me. Seemingly as confused as me, the human seemingly looked at the halfling with disbelief. Finally coming to his senses, the human finally regained his composure to ask a simple question of both our minds. "What are you doing?" Alright, so, we don't really, talk a lot about, the Sonic part of, this game, but, this is, sort of my attempt to sort of, give you an idea of, what it basically sort of, is, how it basically sort of operates. So, it basically sort of, alters, the person's mind, and, makes it so, they, lose sort of, bearing on what's basically going on around them. And, to break it, you basically sort of have to, to notice, the little details in it that, don't make sense, so to speak. Basically, Fay knows that, she hasn't given her name to anyone because, that's not what she does. And there's also the fact that, in, the second chapter, I guess, of this, book, she knew that, the messenger didn't actually ask for her name because he seemed to be, some sort of, aware of, foreign customs. Whereas, this, Sonic guy here, he has no idea what, foreign customs basically are, and, he just, automatically knows the name because, he's Sonic, he's reading a mind, obviously, here. But, whatever. Alright, so, now, I'm not by the way, we also see a little glimpse of, the brawler basically being, sort of, played out here as well. I'll note that there wasn't a whole lot of lore basically about brawlers either, so I want to basically, throw in a brawler just for the sake of, explaining down a little bit as well. So, we're starting to, get, a lot of, different, classes being, sort of explored that, weren't, exploring the lore before this, so, hooray for that. Alright, it's time for the last chapter here, Spared. Alright, so I had to do something, right, to keep the story going, or else she'd just die right there, and that makes no sense for her writing it, but whatever. Here we go. Over time, the Nargol Kingdom apparently caught the ones behind those twisted incidents I witnessed, and more that followed after I left. They publicly executed those who they believed to be the culprits and planted their heads on stakes within the walls of the city. Despite this, though, burning events and other depraved actions were beginning to be taken up by Sinister itself. The messengers may have been killed, but the message they spread persisted. Now, I'm not by the idea of, them, planting their heads on stakes, by the way. This is, sort of, something I sort of built on to sort of, basically, show, basically the consequence of, these guys' actions, when they're basically caught. So it's not the decision for basically having free reign to do whatever they want to. They were eventually caught and had their heads planted on stakes and as a sort of warning not to do this. But it didn't like abate to anything because, like, you know, obviously the acts were being spread still, and, like, you know, it wasn't basically being stopped at all because, like, you know, more people just take up the cause now. And honestly, like, the message being spread, this sort of, like, you know, builds on the fact that, like, you know, the Stinger are basically using, like, you know, Sonic, like, you know, messaging to, like, you know, convince people to basically, like, do their bidding, where, like, you know, they, like, want to or not, but whatever. Alright, so, one more, I'm just gonna take one more swig of water before we continue here, so give me a moment. Alright, so, abruptly before giving the halfling even a moment to respond, the human seemingly began raving at the halfling, saying, "You don't seriously mean to spare her. She's in league with the Shaloran. She's in league with magic." The human's tone progressively got more emotional as the tirade continued. "Have you forgotten our mission and what we are charged to do? This thalore has turned her back on nature. She must stop." The human stopped talking as the halfling raised a hand up in motion to stop, and in a deeper tone than what I expected from someone of such a small size, calmly replied back, "Enough." The human's body shrank back at this, and don't mask, I could sense the disbelief and dismay from the body language. The halfling put down the hand before finally responding with an explanation stating, "Our mission is to root out the foul practitioners of the arcane, and to make sure no further tragedies occur from magic failings." The halfling took a deep breath before continuing to say, "This thalore is no spell cast." The human abruptly cut off the halfling from speaking to yell with great fury, "So what? She is associated with the Shaloran, the ones who caused the spell." Once again, the halfling put up a hand, and again the human ceased to talk. Finally silent, the halflings put down a hand, and I slowly felt some of the pressure on me relax. Somewhat tensely, the human finally turned away in disgust before heading towards the entrance to the tent. As the human left, I could feel the halfling proceed to get off me and step away. Slowly I made to get up as the halfling turned his head and looked at me in my direction. As I came to my feet, I decided to ask, "Who are you really?" Turning its body fully towards me, the halfling seemingly paused a moment before answering me. "Do you wish to truly know?" It was my turn to pause as this question was put to me. These fanatics had been responsible for the sickening spectacle that I witnessed outside. I was also now angry due to my treatment within the tent, now seemingly driving me to seek out an explanation. Finally replying to the halfling, I replied, "I want to know why." The halfling remained silent, emotions covered by the mask, and body language indicating nothing to me either. The only thing I could tell about the halfling was the military attire being worn. I noticed what seemed like a complete set of leather armor, with gloves and boots included. Seemingly, we merely stood looking at each other, not saying anything. Was the halfling perhaps looking for something within me? I don't know. Well, I can tell you with each passing moment, I was becoming angrier and more full of rage inside. Having enough of the silence and wanting my answer, I was about to begin shouting before at last the idea stayed. Because nature has suffered enough, has it not? The sentence that was uttered struck deeply. I was immediately reminded of the reasons I had headed down to Elvia, of the rage and anger that had driven me to make the journey. But the actions that these masked individuals seem less about exacting revenge for wrongdoing to nature. No, it seemed closer to a vendetta against magic, and with the Spellblaze came an excuse to kill the practitioner of magic and destroy their works. Regaining my composure, I replied, "Does that justify killing the innocent?" To this, I could feel a dark emotion rise from the halfling. I had truly hit a nerve for the halfling. In this instant, after that, though, all I could feel was pain. I didn't even see the halfling move, before I felt the punch connect with my stomach. Looking down, I saw the halfling below, just as a fist connected with the bottom of my jaw. Stunned by the blow, I stumbled a bit before falling down. Now looking up at the halfling, I could see the rage emanating towards me, towards the words I had just uttered. Innocent? There is no innocence in those who pervert nature and her design. There can be no forgiveness for them either. I should have been afraid of the halfling at this point, but the anger inside me fueled me to go forward. As I got up to my feet, I fired back. Does that justify the atrocity display I saw outside then? To take random people from their homes, charge them with what you see as wrongdoings, and then execute them in a fiery display? The halfling dropped to a less hostile stance and replied, "If you're referring to the people we named, then know that they were all defiers of nature. Potion brewers, rune masters, a blacksmith who specialized in magical artifact creation, and more than a dozen mages capable of casting spells. We've done great care in identifying the various users who twist nature to their whims." The halfling trailed off to take a breath before continuing with the final sentence. "As for how we killed them, a message needs to be sent, to be seared into the hearts and minds of all the citizens of the city and elsewhere. Perhaps you may not have a stomach for it. If so, I suggest you go back to your little forest, thalore. This won't be the last display you will likely see." I don't know what made me more angry at that point, the seemingly callous nature of the halfling or suggestion to simply go back home. What I didn't know was that I was livid. Seemingly the halfling noticed this and tried to reorient his posture, attempting to redirect my anger. The halfling quickly opined, "Of course. You seem like you were made of sterner competition than most. Head to the south shoreline, then turn east. You'll find a path leading toward our base." Registering the words, I took a moment to analyze them in my head before asking, "And why should I do that?" Without missing a beat, the halfling quickly replied back, "You wish to know why, do you not? Go talk to our instructors if you truly wish to know who we are." With this, the halfling turned to leave the tent. The anger within me had not subsided much, but I made no further attempt to confront the halfling. Battered and bruised, I sank down to the ground and rested a moment. Pulling one of the infusions I had recently purchased from the market, I began to treat my wounds. When I felt better, I was in better shape. When I felt I was in better shape, I got up again and left the tent. Looking up, I noticed that evening sky and decided that I would be staying one more night in the Nargol Kingdom. I made my way back to the inn where I slept in a bed until the next day. When I left, I headed straight to the gates of the sea to make my way out. There I pondered where my next destination would be, before finally heading south. Alright, so, that's it for basically book 2 here, and I'll note very much, basically, like, as you basically read through this lore here, you basically see that, like, we're basically like, getting like a sort of a glimpse of basically, like, how these guys basically sort of operate. They're basically like, not necessarily doing it just for like the hatred of like spellcasters, but they're basically doing it as like, a hatred against like magic itself, and like, the spellcasters are just like, just tied to it, so they're just like can be killed as a result of it. We're also seeing that like, the like, movement isn't entirely like, just like an undisciplined mess, so there is actually some like sort of sense of order to like these guys here, and that's like something I basically note here about these guys here, in general. They're basically like, they're very clever to Ziggurat. They're not like stupid. Well, I say they're not stupid. They're basically like, sort of foolishly like giving like, Fay basically like option to go like to their like very base like, basically like, either become an initiate or basically either be killed perhaps. Not really like, knowing basically how strong she basically is. Though that might be like more of like, a missight basically on the part like, of like this halfling here, because like, it wasn't that hard to like sort of subdue Fay for her, so how much of a threat basically is she really? But whatever. Alright, so that's basically book 2 basically done. At some point I'll basically jump into book 3, but that's good enough for now. I'll probably go back basically to like clear out like the halfling ruin complex, so we'll basically like be doing that soon. But this is good enough for now. And I hope you guys basically enjoy like the reading there. Take care.